So I'm Paul Bolster, and I'm going to do some interviews with Democratic candidates with the hope that you get to know them and you get active in the political process. First, we're going to start with Attorney General, and we have with us this morning Bob Trammell. He's from Lutherville down in Meriwether County, but he got out of there to go to University of Virginia for law school. He came back and was a federal judge, a clerk with a federal judge. He worked for a large Atlanta law firm, and then he decided to go back hometown for a hometown law practice. But he did run for the legislature, and he became a minority leader for the House. We're trying to change that. So for 4 years. So Bob, if I have I left out anything else that the voters might want to know about?
Paul, I think you covered it. I wish we were in the majority when I was in the legislature. We could have done a lot of good for Georgians.
Let me ask you the main question I think voters would be interested in is, why are you running for Attorney General? What motivates you to get out there and do this work and make yourself available to the voters?
Well, Paul, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And the question about the why sort of starts with my experience of having spent most of my life in a small town, the town of Luthersville, as you mentioned, of about 800 people, where my wife, Jenny, who is a pharmacist, and I are raising our three children, ages 13, 11, and 7. And when you live in a small town, and really regardless of the size of the community you live in, there are certain values that we all aspire to. And those are things like looking out for your neighbor, protecting the most vulnerable, and building community. And in today's politics, those are exactly the things that we're missing. We see a politics that seeks to pit people against one another, a politics that promulgates policies that actually prey on the most vulnerable instead of protecting the most vulnerable. And we see policies that tear community apart. And so I'm running for Attorney General because we need an Attorney General who will stand for the rule of law, make life more affordable for Georgians, and defend the Constitution.
What's the most important part of being Attorney General? I know you're the chief law enforcement officer. You're going to represent the state and defend the state in every way you can. So in your mind, what's kind of the most important role that the Attorney General plays?
That's an excellent question. And the Attorney General has a lot of roles, all of which are important. But to me, in the moment that we're in, the most important thing that the Attorney General can do is stand for the rule of law. And to give you a couple of examples that have happened in recent weeks and months, we look at what happened in Minnesota. An administration's disregard for constitutional rights on a day in, day out basis actually led to a tragic loss of life for Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And then we look more locally, right here in our own backyard, where the FBI, in unprecedented action, seized ballots from the Fulton County elections hub simply because the president of the United States sort of directed them to do that. And so we're in unprecedented times when it comes to these types of actions at the federal level from the administration. And attorneys general across the country are in a unique position as sort of the last line of defense against this sort of encroachment. It's an attack not only on Fulton County voters, but it's an attack on the voting rights of all Georgians. And so when I think about the priority for the Attorney General, I think the first order of business is to make sure that the office is in a position to check the Trump administration and hold the Trump administration accountable for the overreach and disregard of the rule of law. And then, broadly speaking, the Attorney General's office is charged under the state constitution with the mandate to protect all Georgians. And we would intend to use the office in ways that would accomplish exactly that, to make sure that the Attorney General is acting as the people's lawyer and protecting Georgians. But if you're asking me to sum it up in the one most important function in this moment in time, it is definitely protecting the rule of law, and that means protecting our democratic processes and election processes right here in Georgia.
You'll be the chief law enforcement officer of the state. Do you see any particular areas? Can you think of an investigation you think that maybe should be going on now, but is not? might be your priority once you get to be Attorney General?
Well, I think that the one thing that we would definitely have direct staff to do is I think that you have to be prepared for the possibilities that can arise, because as the Fulton County example shows, events can happen very quickly, and the Attorney General's office needs to be in a position to go into federal court quickly. So I think the first order of business would be to prepare for the possibilities that exist. We might not be able to perfectly contemplate every possibility, but what we could do is have pleadings ready to go, so that if there is something that happens again, like what happened in Fulton County, that we are ready to go into court. I'll give you another example. Trump frequently talks about the possibility of sending the National Guard into Atlanta. And we know from other states that have Democratic attorneys general where that's happened, that they've had some success. If you look at Oregon, for example, in going into federal court when the Trump administration attempted to deploy the National Guard in Portland. So I think that is one area that we certainly have to make sure that we have staff focused on and have pleadings prepared. Then outside of that, I think the issue of consumer protection, the office has been underutilized. And there are cases that the Attorney General can bring and that would protect Georgians broadly, and that we need to be making sure that we have cases in the pipeline that prevent Georgians from getting abused financially from scammers and ripoffs, they're always out there, but with technology, they're getting increasingly sophisticated. And the Attorney General is sort of a defense for Georgians, and the ability for the Attorney General to protect Georgians is there in statute, and it's been underutilized. And that's an area that I think we should have resources devoted to make sure that we're doing all we can to protect Georgians.
One of the things that bothers me, I'm old, I like using this technology, but somebody's always trying to get into my machine. I think everybody ends up now worrying about whether or not they can keep using their technology to communicate.
Well, I think that falls under the cybercrime. They're only going to get increasingly more sophisticated as time goes on. And we're bombarded every day with, text to the phone, what are called phishing emails, where you inadvertently click a link and then someone is able to hack into your computer or infect your computer. I think that the Attorney General's office definitely has a role to play in that. This is an ocean of, in terms of scale, there's so many scams and attempts to hack and cyber attack people. But all that said, if we concentrate some resources, have some high profile cases that pursue the perpetrators of this type of activity, we signal that Georgia is a place where we intend to protect people's right to use technology without the fear that they will be ripped off or taken advantage of. And I think that's an important mission of the office.
How do you think that's different from what the Attorney General's been doing recently? Currently, Chris Carr or the Republican attorneys general. How is what you're saying a little different from what they've been doing?
Well, I think the question is resource allocation, and what we need is a greater focus on that. One problem we have, and it's not just with the legal side of pursuing these, is that technology advances so quickly that we're often playing catch up as a state. We're playing catch up as a legislature to try and make sure that we have the laws and give the Attorney General's office the tools necessary to pursue these types of cases. But we need to make sure that we have appropriate resource allocation from the General Assembly to specifically tackle this issue. And that, to some extent, would mean more resources for the office on this, and more expertise in terms of pursuing the more sophisticated attacks that are coming online. And then, the other component is that you just have to file cases, and you have to pursue those cases to the fullest extent of the law. And that just requires a specific commitment to do that.
Can you think of some cases that you are involved in Lutherville there that you're particularly proud of, that you defended some local folks and that you were particularly excited about?
Yeah, this question, it reminds me of the question my children sometimes ask me about, Dad, what's the most important case that you've ever done? And my answer to that question is always the same. They're all important, right? Each case is important in its own regard. But I think that there are a couple of cases that sort of come to mind when I think about the broad array of types of cases and the work that we've done that I'm particularly proud of. One case is fairly recent. A local resident here had been incarcerated, and during his period of incarceration, he experienced what is part of the constitutional crisis we have in our prison system. He was attacked and wounded while he was in state custody on a couple of occasions. And on both occasions, there was the involvement of the actual officers, at the jail who helped facilitate it. It was a very sad case where he was stabbed 7 times because a jailer popped the cell door for another inmate to come in and stab him, and then he was left after receiving 7 stab wounds. He was left in his cell for a couple of hours until someone else came by and called medical. And I highlight this one because, number one, it's not the type of case that you would typically think of from a practice in a city of Luthersville size, but it illustrates exactly how our prisons are in the midst of a constitutional crisis when it comes to the way that people who are held in state custody are being treated, the deprivation of their constitutional rights. And so that was a case where we litigated against the Department of Corrections to try and bring some relief, not only for our client, but to also bring a focus to what's happening in Georgia's prison system. One other case that I want to highlight, we litigated against a payday lender. And, payday lending in Georgia has been illegal under the law for quite some time, but this was a payday lender that was set up in the Columbus area. The operation was preying mainly on our military and our veterans right there at the base in Columbus. And they would do things like take a paycheck and hold it, and they were charging just absolutely outrageous rates of interest on small amounts, but that over time you were just on a treadmill where you could never catch up and repay. And the activity was both criminal and civil in nature. The ultimate owner wound up going. He was prosecuted. He was one of the Interpol's top fugitives internationally because he went on the run and actually left this country. I think he was ultimately found and arrested somewhere in South America and brought back to this country. It was a case that, again, when we talk about ripoffs and scams, it was a case that by being able to help shut that down, we were able to protect numerous Georgians from that practice of being victim to predatory lending.
I followed the legislation on that for a number of years. It's always a bill. A lot of members of the legislature signed the bill. Oftentimes, the bill was authored by a Republican, but the bill never gets a hearing in the House and never gets to the House or Senate floor as a result of the leadership. The other part of this is you may have a Republican governor and an attorney general that's a Democrat. So maybe talk a little bit about that party differences that we sometimes have in the state, especially related to the payday lending issue. I wish that legislation passed and actually regulate them as a financial institution, because they're now regulated as a pawn shop of all things.
When I was minority leader in the legislature, there were a lot of issues that we were in the position of trying to protect Georgians against a lot of bad ideas. It was very difficult to get traction on things about regulating in a way that would be able to protect more Georgians. The one thing about being in the minority is that the Republican majority is the one in control of which bills get a hearing and which bills, ultimately get to the floor to vote on. So we had a lot of great pieces of legislation that we would have loved to get to the floor for a hearing that would have benefited Georgians, including protecting people on the consumer finance side. But the question you ask about having attorney general of one party and a governor of another party, we haven't had that in a while. The last time we had that was Robert Baker was the Democratic attorney general and Sonny Perdue was the Republican governor. There's actually a Georgia Supreme Court case about, what the independent constitutional authority of the attorney general, so that the attorney general represents the state and isn't the governor's personal lawyer. If this sounds a little bit familiar, we've seen in Washington the disastrous consequences when the Department of Justice begins to function as the president's personal lawyer and not as the independent justice organization to protect the United States of America. But what would happen in the event that you have an attorney general of one party and a Republican governor is that you do set up the potential for if the governor, and it's true regardless of party, but I think it makes more likely the scenario where if the Republican governor oversteps the law, the attorney general has to be ready and willing to go to court to make sure that the state is protected and that the law is followed. And we would certainly intend to do that. That applies no matter whether you have a Republican governor or a Democratic governor. That principle is still the same, that the attorney general has to be in a position to protect Georgians and make sure that Georgia is following the law. But I do think that particularly in today's climate, where you see Republican governors in some states seeking to follow the unconstitutional dictates from the Trump administration, it does make that possibility of conflict more likely. But listen, in our country, there is a place where conflicts go to be resolved, and that's go to court, and that's the job of the attorney general.
In the last few minutes we have here, Democrats are going to be voting on May the 19th for our nominee for the attorney general. And so one of the questions in my mind is, what's your strategy for winning in November? And why would Democrats choose you as a candidate to have the best chance to win in November?
Well, look, I'm battle tested. I was Democratic leader for 4 years, and I know what it's like to fight. And I have been in 5 general election contests. And every time I've been in a general election, I have been in a district where Democrats don't typically win. My legislative district, which spanned from Newnan to LaGrange, was a district while they were electing me to serve in the state house. They were also voting for Donald Trump for president and Brian Kemp for governor. So I have experience when it comes to assembling the type of coalition that you need to not only a legislative district like that, which requires you to have a coalition of Democrats, some Republicans, and independents in order to win an electoral majority. And that's exactly what we have to have in Georgia. We have to have Democrats, a sliver of Republicans for whom enough is enough. They simply can't take what's going on anymore in Washington and here in Georgia, and independents to come along. And in order to attract the segment of Republican voters and independents, you need someone who is able to talk in a way and has a record and experience in communicating with those voters. And we did that when we were in the legislature and in my legislative district. And I think we're positioned to do that in the general election in November.
I wish you good luck in the election. So thank you very much.
Listen, thanks so much for having me.